This is Dave Monk, your Prairie Monk, WAFC Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. We've been trying to look at nonprofit agencies and what they do and how they do it. And we've come to the point of trying a GoFundMe. It's reasonably easy to do. You have to have some statement as what you do. So I'll run through that just to give you an idea of what you might have to do if you encounter the same problem. That you need funding, and this can be a help. So first of all, we need to know what Heartland Pathways is about. We're using Heartland Pathways as an example. It basically buys up old railroad lines for possible re-rail. That's if a grain company wanted to come back on the line, or if a historic group wanted to re-rail. But it can also serve as a trail, and most importantly for us in prairie preservation, it requires prairie and explanation of prairie. It needs to be fairly brief, perhaps a page long, enough to give people a chance to know what you're doing and why. So then you need to explain how we would go about doing that in a sentence or two. And I have this on a page so that I can explain to you what we have been doing. We need to give examples of what we have done in the past, briefly. Rail trail at Monticello and prairie preservation on the right of way on either side of the ballast. And we are in the process of re-railing 4 miles of roadbed between the Railroad Museum and Seymour, with the hope of getting historic trains into Champaign. The prairie will remain on the side, and there's an adjacent interurban, which we hope could be a trail parallel to the rail. Until the rail is installed, which will take quite some time, the beds will be available for trail. So briefly, don't go into too much details. You don't have to say that we have to remove the trees so that the easement for power won't short to the ground and cause a fire. It's fairly simple. We explain that we have to have a physical plant to do these things, to have vehicles and a building, and we teach, and then there's a certain degree of readiness. You might want to mention that the National Rail to Trail Conservancy has been doing very well, and that encourages us to think about 33-mile railroad bed restored as a trail with prairie on the side. So the objectives are then what you need. In one case, we would like to buy an adjacent 5 acres adjacent to 6-acre prairie we have in Rantoul. We need to upgrade our remnant prairies. At one stage, we have to perhaps explain the remnant prairie is a prairie that's been around since glaciation retreated 10,000 years ago. And we need to upgrade our physical plant, which includes a building. Then we wish to solicit funds, and you have to let people know what you might want. In this case, if you're looking at restoring 33 miles to a rather healthy potential rail trail, you might warn that you want 100,000 now, but that's for immediate maintenance and upgraded prairie and physical plant. But in the long run, this corridor will go into many generations and require, in the long run, substantially a few $1 million worth of infrastructure. If you're going to convert a railroad bed to a trail and put down chip limestone or asphalt or concrete, that is an objective. And we do want to warn that this is just a start to long-range planning. You have to give details of where you can be contacted and an address, an email, a web page, and YouTube or other information. And we also need to remind people that we do a lot of media, whether it be radio or television or art and silk screening. So that statement is fairly brief. We may have to modify it, but I'm working with Art Tucker, who used to run the Verde Gallery in town, and an assistant, Marianne, who is checking out the details that we might want to work with. It's ambitious, but it's also essential because we have the problem of code people not being happy with our physical plant, especially. And worldwide, the code people don't always conform to the aesthetics and the information that's contained in paper. So we do have a silkscreen operation, which stores paper. When the prints are made, they have to be stored. We use them for educational purposes often, and also occasionally for sale to keep our system going. But it's a paper chase. In the front, we have tools that we use for our sites, whether they be a mile away or 2 mile away or 20 mile away. If volunteers come, you can't go looking for tools elsewhere. It's been very handy to have them inside the building. The street has been gentrifying. That means it's been upgraded and developed. The process hasn't finished yet, but when we came to Champaign from being with the university, we occupied 3 out of 4 buildings in this corridor, and those 3 buildings have been condensed into 1 building. So there's a concentrated paper chase. And most of it is responsible. It's not just done. And we especially have loose material like newspapers that give us information. It's enough to remind me what you might want to do, who you might want to meet, and whether you might want to buy a piece of land advertised in the newspaper. So all of those things are fire hazards, and the backing for prints is cardboard, and cardboard is a fire hazard. And the building is old, and we have not repaired it in 40 years, so it has a need for plumbing and electricity that we can't afford. So the next thing we have to look at is if the front foyer or the front facade needs to be tuck pointed. That's a cost of $6,000. It may be that we can get a grant from the city for part of that price because the city wants to upgrade. There's an addition that's on the front of our storefront that is on the ugly side. It gave the engravers who owned the 8 buildings here some extra space. Weft next door has taken off that 3-foot addition, but it would cost us probably $3,000 to remove it and replace it with a more historic front. The furniture in the building is often secondhand furniture and makeshift. So that would involve getting steel horizontal filing cabinets for artwork, and that would take materials off a desk, which is loose and also a fire hazard. Once again, a cost, and the cost may be involved in grant requests or a GoFundMe. And once we make an application for GoFundMe, we have to increase our membership and start to go from a fairly small board to a group of people who care about what we preserved. It's a skeleton for the future. I mentioned millions of dollars. The Kickapoo Trail at the moment is running about $20 million, and that will increase, but you have to spread that $20 million over many generations. A railroad has the right to come back in, and it's highly unlikely that it will come back in. So, and in the interim, you have a trail which is rather popular, and the federal government gives money to preserve that that bed because to replace it in 100 years' time would be very, very expensive and almost impossible to do. So hikers and bikers and biologists are being used to preserve the railroad bed. And as far as the Federal Surface Transportation Board is concerned, this is an economy to buy the idea and to keep the bed afloat for future use. They're particularly interested in connections like between Urbana and Danville, which were a main line and could be a main line. A little bits of pieces of railroad and abandonment here and there are not quite so interesting. Our Heartland Pathways is in 3 separate units on the end of a 7-mile railroad museum. So that's not as attractive for funding with the Federal Rail Banking Act interim trail use. So building upgrade is important. Prairie preservation is important. There's almost hardly anything left, and that makes it hard for people to work with it. There's an occasional cemetery here and there, and rail beds, active or passive, have small elements of prairie that's come through from 10,000 years ago when glaciers retreated, the world warmed up. Then little patches here and there that have niches, so it's not necessarily all the prairie plants in one spot, and it's tremendously difficult to preserve. So building upgrade, prairie upgrade, and trail potential. The trail needs to be reasonably narrow. You could take a 100-foot wide right of way with a ballast in the middle, and there's a few feet, perhaps 20 feet on either side, that is preservation potential. If that embankment perhaps is rip-rapped down the side, there gets to be very little habitat left. So there's a debate between preservation people and the rail trail people, and EPA, Environmental Protection Agency, and ADM, American Disabilities Act, to have a wide trail. So you have a debate. So at this stage, you start to think about what you and next generation and next generation after that might want to do with this skeleton. In the meantime, you have to preserve it so it doesn't get destroyed. And you have to have some imagination as to where it might go in the future. So there is a need for planning, regional planning. So you also have to think about how this particular Heartland Pathways resource relates to other resources. So we've been talking to Railroad Museum about the possibility of taking a train down to Shady Rest that's on the banks of the Sangamon. It has a truss bridge, which people have put money into preserving that railroad bed and truss bridge. And there's a potential for Chautauqua there, a picnic ground, but there's also a soil and water conservation easement for the natural history that's on the spot. There's the spring herbs are tremendous. The summer leftovers are there, the nettles and gingers and things like that that can handle shade. And it's also got bottomland next to the Sangamon, but it's very near to the Cerro Gordo Moraine, and there's the potential for having a some sort of natural history museum there. So you have to dream, and you have to talk to railroad people. If it's 1 mile, you have to be concerned about the embankments, the sharing with people who want to walk on the railroad bed. It's a paranoia for people who drive engines, and so you have to have a debate with people who can drive a train at 2 miles an hour and provide a novelty experience for people who haven't ridden a train before, and to go to a horsey or a chautauqua and meet with other people who have similar interests, and perhaps even occupy a cabin and stay over for a night or go fishing. So talking is a replacement for regional planning. You need to know that in the Monticello area, it's between Champaign-Urbana and Decatur. It's accessible from Bloomington and communities around. It's also on a highway, so it can be accessible for ecotourism. It has a historic square with the courthouse is intact. So Monticello has its own character. It has a railroad museum that has been there for now probably 30 years. And it also has character, and it also can store railroad cars for companies who don't have that sort of bed to be able to do that. So the Railroad Museum has a interurban that can store cars, and it also has a main line, of which they use 3 miles to get into Monticello with a tourist train, and 4 miles, which is storage. We like to dream about a mile of main line going down to Shady Rest. It would cost probably $3 million to do that. To take that line down there, you have to have ties, you have to have rail, and you have to work it so that a trail can probably go down the middle of the railroad line, because you can't put a trail adjacent to the ballast, because it's high and there's no room. So there's just a sharing of resources. It's got precedence. It had a huge precedent in the era when trams and trains ran through downtown Chicago or other places. So it's been done before. People and rolling stock uses the territory without necessarily fatal results. You don't have to be moving a train at a huge pace. You do have warning devices. You can schedule, you can have lights so that the traffic, including the trains, can have some control. So that means we have to talk about the possibility of that sort of alternative. Since much of the storage 3 miles of the Railroad Museum are occupied, we'd like to suggest that the triangle of, it's called a Y at White Heath, where you can take a train down one side and across the bottom of the triangle and back so that you can turn a train around. You can also send the train in different directions. So a train coming from Champaign could choose to go to Monticello or go to Clinton. So it's a very interesting place. It's a place where work materials are stored. There was an elevator, and there's a spirit within some circles to recreate a wooden elevator there, which used to be, and bring it in from other places like Lodge, where there is such an elevator, and to recreate that site and to perhaps store a train. It might be a two-car train. It might be a diesel motor rather than a steam engine. A steam engine is heavy and has a poundage at the bottom of a drive wheel, which is serious and can make it difficult for rail, especially if you have lightweight rail. So you have to think about the not only the weight per yard of the rail track. On a main line, it might be 135 pounds a yard, but on an interurban, it might be 69 pounds per yard. So you also have to look at the cross section of the rail, because some cross sections are more strength strong than others. And you also, if you're running on one particular type of rail, it is awkward to be using several different styles of cross-section of railroad. You need to know that the ballast is responsible and that the bridges are responsible. Bridges can be expensive, even if they're a culvert and small bridges. Could the train go out onto the truss bridge? Yes, if it's a lightweight train, perhaps. And so that train could also go towards Champaign. So could we keep a small train element in that triangle? Could the people of Whiteheath find it interesting to do it and to protect it, because railroad yards can be vulnerable to vandalism and misuse and the theft of steel for scrapping. And so you can't just leave resources around and hope that they will stay there. Even if they're heavy resources, they can be moved with a front end loader and a semi-trailer or a low loader. These things happen. So the first thing to do is to get your clients to look at your GoFundMe summary and then ask questions about what might be in your evil mind for the future. And one of those things would be to think about expanding the Monticello Railroad Museum, which is a national level museum. And this would allow the Railroad Museum to go down to the Sangamon, where they don't have that sort of resource already. And so the next thing is to not only have a concept of what sort of train you would have, but you would also like to know what you're going to see and what the Sangamon is like, and is it flood prone, and how can you restore that with reasonable costs and a little bit of excitement. And so the adjacent 30 acres of Shady Rest is in the Piatt County Forest Preserve. And so you have to know the Forest Preserve and that they have uh, in perpetuity for the 30 acres, and they have the capacity to have a tax base from the county and the ability to put in trails, and they've done that. So begging your clients to go to Shady Rest several times in springtime and in summertime, in fall and winter, and enjoy it. So we're talking to George Roadcap, whose son just loved to go to Shady Rest, and you can go there too. You might want to pick a time when it's not loaded with mosquitoes, but that's the name of the game. With a little more imagination, you might continue that rail up to Lodge, where it could meet with another north-south active line and take a perhaps once or twice a year restauranting on the rails to Lodge and back down to Monticello and the Nelson Crossing Railroad Depot, where the Railroad Museum has its yards. Experimental dreaming, which may never happen, but if you don't dream, it will never happen. And if it sparks some interest, then you might be surprised that something interesting will happen, and it's an attraction for the region and for ecotourism. And so there's some tourism money, there's restauranting money, there's bicycle way money. So how do we put these thoughts together? And so our move to do a GoFundMe is to also ask you to be aware, to go visit, to get on your computer and look at the satellite feed and follow it through. And you might not know exactly where to go. So that means we have to have people like David Wasani to create maps and charts and show you where to go. We might have to get onto Zoom with you and actually direct you to interesting spots that there. You have to go under a 72 at one stage with going down to Shady Rest. So we've had to beg the Department of Transportation not to fill in that railroad passageway, but that makes it a little more interesting. You're going to go under a concrete bridge and just enjoy life and at the same time preserve the natural history on either side. At Monticello, we have 2 mile of railroad bed. It started out with 1 mile, and it's parallel to a road that comes off of 72, which is rather busy and not very safe for hikers and bikers. So this mile allowed people from Old Town Monticello to go down to the river and across on a truss bridge that Heartland Pathways owns, and then to County Farm Road, which allows people to go directly to Allerton Park, which is a huge natural area. And it also is a biological place with places for rookeries, for birds, for salamanders and wetlands. And it has a prairie adjacent to the Heartland Pathways Railroad bed, which is a reconstruction prairie, but it's a rather good reconstruction prairie. And one of the things is to try and activate rattlesnakes there that are an endangered species. So we want you to know about this. We want you to be aware that in some places there's poison ivy. So just don't just go out there in short shorts and not be prepared to deal with the reality of life. Canada thistle, teasel, and honeysuckle, and autumn olive. All we need action. So one of the things we need is people who have a commitment. Their lifestyle is that they may be around town periodically at least, and be able to save some of their heritage prairie, which is down to about the status preserve 0.01%. You've all heard it. Champaign County was 94% prairie. So planting a forest tree is not planting your heritage. It's prairie that is important. And there are people like Liz Kirby and Phil Holt that have worked with the Forest Preserve acquisition to create a Sangamon River prairie. And then there's a debate of how pure is it, and how weedy is it, and do you have a pavilion where people can come and take a picnic table? Can you provide water, drinking water for people? Is there parking? Does the parking violate the dignity of the prairie? No. Is there a terrain? Yes. So there's natural wetland, and there's upland, dryland, and creeks and drainage ditches that run into the Sangamon. And there's the Sangamon right alongside, and the silhouette of trees growing on the banks of the Sangamon. And there's a debate about whether the canoeists can remove the snags, the trees that have fallen into the river, that mean that you have to portage your canoe around the tree and put the canoe back in again. That moment, it probably takes 8 hours to canoe from Mahomet to Monticello. And so that could be speeded up by clearing out the river. But the biologists don't want to see that. They want to see those trees rot and get fungi in them, and they're part of the biodiversity. So talking about these things is tremendous. It doesn't always work out. The Forest Preserve has acquired a Isaac Walton League building, which was put together by people who were willing to teach people how to fish, to teach people how to do things with nature. And the people who did a lot of that grew older, and the sites that were more interesting in Colorado could be reached with vehicles that weren't available before. So gradually it got to not have membership, and was given to the Forest Preserve. So not always does your organization go into perpetuity. So then the next question is, where could it go? So the Isaac Walton League cabin went to the Forest Preserve. We look at some of our prairies and wonder if the Grand Prairie Friends might take over. So you have to realize that the Grand Prairie Friends didn't exist at one stage. The park districts didn't exist at one stage. The Forest Preserve in Champaign County is about 75 years old. So you have to know that someone had to have the idea of putting together a Forest Preserve or a conservation district in order to preserve some of the dignity of your heritage, which includes prairie, some forest, but not a lot of forests. And sometimes it was cottonwood trees that had deep roots and could survive a drought and lots of water if a flood. So if you don't have an organization that's regional planning, officially so stated, and then you're not likely to have that, because nobody wants to be told what to do with a plan. But you can talk and have small meetings and gradually get ideas around. You inevitably will have naysayers who don't want to do this or that, and a naysayer can, one or two naysayers can really be very, very strong. They can, unfortunately, people are sometimes more interested in naysayers than they are in positive movements. So you have to watch naysayers, and you may have to talk to them for 15 years. This plot may be next to a house and therefore a fire hazard or a people hazard. But after 15 or 20 years and the growth of the prairie or the forest area that's there, the naysayers may be one of your best supporters. So talking and listening, listening to different ideas, listening to historic stories, listening to family units. At Rantoul, we have a planning family where grandfather is very familiar with our interest in a 10-mile trail, prairie trail on an old road between Rantoul and Paxton, and he would love that. And he has a family that has a concrete construction company, and then you get to know that they also revere the prairies that you have and might be able to help bring a bulldozer and get rid of trash that had been dumped on our prairie when it was a borrow pit or a gravel pit. But gradually you talk and listen and get ideas. If you run east and west on a moraine, sometimes you get very interesting rolling moraine, whether it be at the Bloomington Moraine at Rantoul or at the Hensley Moraine in Clinton, or the Cerro Moraine at Rantoul, at Monticello. So people have to get an idea of contours, get an idea of the 5 rivers that empty Champaign County, a rather wet county, swampy county in its early days, had to be drained. So how do you drain it? Can you use horses? Can you use oxen because they have cloven hooves and can handle mud better than a horse? Can you introduce steam tractors and pull a drag line across from one tractor to another? Stationary tractors sitting on the edge of a drainage ditch. Or do you create a pontoon? You almost create a river by creating a pontoon that you can put a dragline train in. So you have a more or less a flat ship in the pond with a crane on it, and the crane can work its way down the river by taking the soil out and putting it on a levee, which also protects the land on the other side, the land that's being worked. So there's a history there. So you need a history museum like the Forest Preserve, the Prairie Museum, and you there find teaching and archives. And once again, people come forth with material that may have been sitting in an attic or a basement for years. It's kind of sad that these materials are vulnerable to humidity in a basement or attic, but often Sidorus had pictures like that, and they resurrected them. And so now there are publications of photographs, early photographs taken by Sidorus. And it was an era when photography was reasonably early. And if you manipulated the photograph so that you had a person sitting in the tree and it had been manipulated, the person wasn't really sitting in the tree, you had worked in the dark room, which is now obsolete, and you put in a picture of the person in the tree, and that was regarded as freaky. That was playing with people's bodies, and so you have to encounter and understand religious beliefs or oddball beliefs that are not necessarily scientific, but they are very strong. So if you don't eat certain plants, or you do eat certain plants, then they become targets. And right now, I'm thinking of the history of a little jail in Sidorus, where Sidorus came to town and got bogged and kind of settled in Sidorus, and the village of Sidorus bears his name. But there was a jail which is about 10 by 10 with flat boards, and it could house 2 drunks overnight. Or it was a character. It had it wasn't easy for them to climb up and out. But almost you could put our arms around it and hug it. It was so small. But that was on a farm. You perhaps I would think about moving that jail to a public museum. And that doesn't always work, because sometimes the location is the location. The building that you want to move was at a location because of certain things, like the Pepsin factory in Monticello was had a history, an economic development history, where somebody, the local Dr. Caldwell, was working with a newly discovered enzyme called pepsin, and it was very successful at quieting people's stomachs, whether they had constipation or diarrhea. It was very, very effective, and it grew from being a store with an apple cider press on the square at the Monticello to a Piatt County family house that was eventually surrounded by an E of factories, some 5 stories high, some 2-3 stories high, and in an E with the Piatt County house there. And this was in a location where there were railroad lines around it that took the product out to the rest of the world. And I was very sad to see that building destroyed. It was a historic monster as a part of Monticello's history. It was touted as ugly. It was a simple factory without a great deal of aesthetics. It needed $55,000 worth of roofing. So it was leaking. I would pump the water out with a hose and a pump out through a window, hoping to keep the concrete of the building afloat. But eventually it was taken down. But that was a building called a graveyard. It had up to 250, I think, even 300 people employed there on the stage. And it was friendly. It had a court for playing basketball. I don't know whether it had a pool, but it had a lot of people who regarded it as home. As I worked with that, tried to preserve that factory, people would come by and say, I used to shine the handrails to the second floor, or I used to know the Hart family who were the entrepreneurs who benefited from this and put up a State Street that was with big buildings. The stable building is big enough for a house, let alone the house itself. So Monticello has that background of wealth on State Street. So talking about where the interurban came through, when it went 8 miles south to be meant, past a cemetery, and then to meet the Wabash line, and to go parallel to the Wabash line into Decatur, to have a Penn Central Railroad close out between Paris and Hinesboro and Arcola and Arthur and Heavey City and Decatur. That could have been prairie preservation. It was taken over by the Department of Natural Resources, but so late that 11 sites had been sold, so you couldn't, or people weren't willing to give back that land for a trail. But there was substantial plots of remnant prairie, which we've lost. That's a huge loss of the last remaining habitat that we have in this region. So once again, you have to be in those communities. You have to go to their summer festivals. You have to meet with the people at the elevator. You have to find the people who might be adjacent to you and might have drainage problems. Are they okay? Yes, and we also like to walk your trail and use a motorcycle and watch the trees grow and walk around the trees and perhaps invade a little bit. So you have to be there with a survey and try to stop that. I'm paying $12,000 for a survey on one plot where it was a warranty deed which you own very well. So you have to know about deeds. You have to know about a warranty deed, which means that the railroad bought the land and owns it. And an easement, which means that the railroad rents the land. As long as the railroad is there, it returns to the owner in various types of easements. And then there's adverse possession, where the railroad went through and on 10 or 15 feet of land and just didn't tell anyone. So those pieces go back to the people. So you have to know that, and you have to listen to the stories. So you have someone in a pickup truck check you out for your trees that are growing on the railroad bed, shading his soybeans and shading his corn. And you can see it, the height of the corn is low and the beans are rather miserable. And I have an agricultural background, so I understand farming, and you talk and gradually you get to understand each other, and the person takes goes to his vehicle and opens the storage unit and brings out a copy of where his ancestors are buried in a nearby cemetery. And so you get that rapport. I'm not sure. I didn't remember my time, but I think we are getting near the end. But I really want to encourage you to think about this 33-mile of resource that has 3 truss bridges, 27 trestles, and 360 acres of ground. That's if they haven't been invaded some. We have to give them easements. We have to explain to people that the vegetation is a way of life. It's a land use, and it has a right to be there. It's not something that you look at and think that this is a unused territory. It's wasted. It could be 6 more rows of corn and soybeans. And so you have to know that debate. You have to know the price of corn, and the price of wheat, and price of soybeans, and know the language. You have to go to the railroad seminars to understand the language of railroaders, and be able to discuss taking a rail back on re-rails abandoned railroad, or take a railroad down to Shady Rest, or work with the Railroad Museum, or work with the Champaign, Havana, and Western Historic Railroad, which would like to take historic trains into Champaign or other communities. You know. I'm going to say goodbye now. I hope that you will join us in a GoFundMe efforts. It's an experiment, and we encourage you to look for the future. It might be 5 generations before some of the ideas that we have might go into action. And there's always a risk that it might fail too. So don't be afraid of failures. They're a part of real life, and you have to have a twinkle in your eye and keep going and do interesting things. So this is Dave Monk, the Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And please look after WEFT, because we are so pleased to be able to broadcast with their facilities. Their celebration is on the 26th of September. It's their 40th birthday. We've been here as associates for many long years, and we like to encourage them the best we can. And they've been out with the Friday night music live, and WEFT does not have any employees. It's all volunteer, and we're air shifters. And so thank you, Dave Monk, Prairie Monk, 90.1 on your FM dial. And we'll encourage you to be out there with your bicycle or your car, or just go commune with what some people think is very fat land and uninteresting land, but it's not. Give it 6 inches difference, and you'll see a difference in the ecosystem. Thanks.